The Illuminate Arts and Faith Conference in Chattanooga, Tennessee wants to help you find your tribe. Do you get way too excited about quoting Wendell Berry or C.S. Lewis in conversations with coworkers? Does your Spotify playlist include hymns, a little jazz, and a whole lot of Andrew Peterson? Join your tribe at Illuminate March 31 and April 1 for education and inspiration from speakers Russ Ramsey, Douglas McKelvey, John Hendricks, and others. Find a complete list of session topics and ticket information at southern.edu/illuminate.
In 2024, I set out to meet as many poets as I could and spend an hour with each one. I got more than I bargained for, more insight, more clarity, more hope. It's proved to be one of the richest highlights of my life. 17 writers, 17 deeply human conversations that made me sit up and pay attention. Franz Kafka once said, if the book we're reading doesn't wake us up with a blow to the head, what are we reading for? A book must be the axe for the frozen sea within us. And that's what I hope this new book will do. I hope it wakes us up, my friends. I hope these conversations will be the catalyst for something to be reawakened, re-enchanted, and reinvigorated. It's called An Axe for the Frozen Sea, Conversations with Poets About What Matters Most. I'm Ben Palpin, and I hope you'll come and listen in as I spend a little time with poets like Lucy Shaw, Malcolm Guite, Dana Gioia, and Lee Young Lee. Pull up a chair at the table as we dig into what it means to write well and to live well. An Axe for the Frozen Sea is now available from Rabbit Room Press. Visit the store at rabbitroom.com, or better yet, ask about it at your favorite bookseller.
I kind of confess at the beginning of the book that I'm not good at this, like that I'm unqualified yet compelled, to write about the love of God. Or I feel the unqualifiedness because I have struggled so much with, does God exist? One, two, if he exists, does he even like me? Not sure about that, even though I've tended to intellectualize my faith for so long. There's reasons for that, but there's, learning all the verses, but not really experiencing it in my gut.
Welcome to the Habit Podcast, conversations with writers about writing. I'm Jonathan Rogers, your host. Quina Aragon is an author, editor, and spoken word poet based in Florida. Her work has been featured by organizations such as Christianity Today, the Gospel Coalition, and Risen Motherhood. Her latest book is Love Has a Story, 100 Meditations on the Enduring Love of God. In this episode, Quina and I talk about why it took her 4 years to write a book she thought would take 10 months. We also talk about connections between counseling and writing, the ways that performing spoken word poetry has impacted Quina's written word, and what it means to feel both unqualified to write and compelled to write. Quina Aragon, I'm so happy to have you on the Habit Podcast. Thanks for being here today.
Thanks so much for having me.
And so I'm excited about your book, Love Has a Story, 100 Meditations on the Enduring Love of God. Tell me about this book. Where did it come from? What's the elevator pitch?
Yeah.
I want to know about your book.
Yeah, so I was asked to be a part of a series with Moody Publishers to write about some attribute of God and do sort of like a 100-day devotional, which, to be honest, when I heard 100 days of anything, I get intimidated. And also I know my propensity to be like on day 14, like, oh, there's another book. So I really wanted to write something that could feel somewhat like a page turner in nonfiction ways. And so I wanted to tell the story of the Bible because I've been really intrigued by biblical theology and really seeing the Bible as one big story, one big epic that is filled with many little stories that make up the one big one. So I wanted to tell the story. And then I also felt like, okay, well, which attribute am I going to do? I ended on love, and there was multiple reasons. I think in the writing process, I realized the reason I may have been drawn to that, despite the fact that there are about 10 million bajillion books on the love of God, rightly so, is that has been the hardest thing for me to really accept in my bones. And I kind of confess that up front in the book is just that has been the hardest thing for me to really believe. And that has a lot to do with my story and things that I've been through. And so it was such a important experience for me as a writer to really re-explore the storyline of Scripture. So I have felt the book is sort of like my passions colliding in some ways. My passion for a spiritual formation and discipleship, in giving readers a sort of introductory level of biblical theology of the storyline of Scripture. And then also marrying that with what I've been blessed to kind of engage in, which is what Dan Allender called story work. So the importance of engaging our own life as a story, looking back at the chapters we'd rather not talk about, the ones that are filled with shame and horror and trauma, and getting curious about what are the main characters and themes and scenes of our lives that comprise our story, so that in better understanding ourselves, we can sort of grow in an agency with God to be co-authors, as Dan Allender put it again, to be co-authors of our story. And so I was very intrigued by that. Something that I have been in the counselee's chair for a long time, and in therapy sessions for a long time. And that's the sort of work that has been going on with me. So I wanted to marry biblical theology with story work. And then as a poet by heart, I wanted to sort of give scenes of my own life and offer examples of what it might look like to engage your story.
Oh, okay. So you're saying, in some ways, the poems are just you putting into practice the principles that you're talking about elsewhere.
Because I'm asking readers to really look into and engage the beautiful and the beastly parts of their stories, and so I would feel wrong to ask that of somebody if I'm not actually modeling that sort of vulnerability. And so the poems are just my natural way of expressing myself in that way. So
I'm so interested in this idea. In counseling, the counselor nudges the counselee or guides the counselee toward toward storytelling. And can you say a little bit more about that? I mean, the relationship between counseling on the one hand, and trauma recovery and those kinds of things, with what we think of as authoring.
Yeah, I think, like you said, the counselor or the therapist has become, in some ways, an expert at asking really good, penetrating questions. Questions that lead you to maybe reframe your experience, to reframe your understanding of yourself, of your life, of the things you've been through, and to maybe ask questions that you've never even thought of asking yourself. And so that's such a skill and such a ministry, I think. And when I think of, in terms of the Bible story, how often God is asking questions, and we can agree that God is omniscient. He already knows all things. But from the beginning, even with Adam, it's where are you? With Elijah, it's what are you doing here, Elijah? And there's so many invitations through question asking that help the person who's receiving that question to maybe express themselves and explore something that maybe they didn't realize was there, to put words to something that has been going on in their internal world. And what a grace of God in question asking, to really invite us into what I think ultimately is the purpose of it, is just intimacy. It's just intimacy with God. It's not that he doesn't know, but he wants us to be able to begin to put words to our experience. And then I think of, where is it in the Psalms, where it's the secret counsel of the Lord is for those who fear him, that there's a sense there in which when we're engaging, whether it's through lament or confession of sin or even praise, that there's this honesty of soul and integrity of heart before God, as we feel him and experience him, whether through the word or just in our meditation time, like hear him asking the questions. And as we put expression to that, it leads us into sort of having a more of a spiritual heightened awareness to see what he has to say about it, or to what he wants to say to us.
And also, if you think about it, so many events in your life, somebody else has already told the story and sort of locked in that story. And it feels like counseling in so many cases is just having a chance to say, is that the actual story of what happened here? You know, and there are these events that happened that maybe in some objective sense, we can all agree that these events happened. And yet, as people who put stories together know, you know, those events mean different. You know, they might not mean what somebody first said they meant. And I don't, you know, I'm not super interested in the idea of, you know, my truth or you know, there is such thing as the truth. And on the other hand, I think sometimes we settle too quickly on somebody else's version of the truth, rather than actually exploring for ourselves what really happened and what this means.
Yeah, without realizing it, which is, I think, was it Adam Young or somebody was talking about we're created in the image of a we, not a me, or not, you know, like it's let us make man. I know that's debated in Genesis 1 in terms of, is that a Trinitarian verse or whatever. But the point is, we were made by a Trinitarian God, by a triune God, a 3-in-1 God. And so we were made for connection from our birth. You know, as babies, we were looking for our mom and dad's face. We're looking for somebody to seek our hearts, to pursue our hearts. And so, you know, the stories that have shaped us are manifold and multidimensional. They come from our society. They come from the cultures we grew up in, of course, our family of origin. And I think, you know, as I say in my dedication in the book, that this is really for curious and aching hearts. When we have an honesty that says, and a willingness to be curious about our own stories, which is a lifelong journey. And what I think a part of what it means to be an apprentice of Jesus is as any apprentice experiences, as being corrected along the way. And so I want to be curious and ask Jesus, well, what's your version of the story here? And I think a last thought there is, I was just listening to Luke, the book of Luke, and when Jesus says there, for what does it profit a man to gain the whole world? And then I noticed in the ESV translation, it says, and forfeit himself. You know, usually I've heard it as lose your soul, and it says forfeit himself. And I think, wow, that's so, C.S. Lewis does such a good job of illustrating this in multiple books, but I think of The Great Divorce in particular, which is the inverse of what Jesus is saying there, which is simply that when we gain Christ, not only do we gain Christ, but he's so good and so gracious that he allows us to then gain our true selves, to let go of our false self, to your point, the stories and the narratives that have driven the lies that have sort of undergirded our lives. And we get to gain who we were always meant to be. And so it's not this annihilation of self, it's this coming into your true self.
Yeah, I love that. That's great. And when you're talking about part of being an apprentice is to be corrected, it's the kindness of Jesus, I think, to say, you had that story wrong. It's better than you thought. You know, the story you're telling is wrong, and that's hallelujah, good news. That story you've been telling is wrong, and here's you know.
Yeah, he never exposes us to leave us naked and ashamed on the side of the street. He never does. He exposes us to clothe us.
Yeah, that's good. Okay. You planned on taking 10 months to write this book, Love is a Story. And instead it took you 4 years. I know how I have some experience with this sort of thing. But what took you so long?
Yeah, credit to Moody Publishers for being very gracious with me. I thought for sure they were going to kick me to the curb. No, I got the contract in 2020, near the end of 2020. So I was very excited. This is my first trade book. I've published 3, children's books, but this is my first grown-up book. So this is very exciting for me. And I get to go through the storyline of scripture, I'd go to the coffee shop. I lived in Tampa at the time and just study and write. And so I was enjoying myself and getting along through the manuscript. And I was probably like 40% done with it. And one night I woke up next to my husband. It was like 2 a.m. And all of a sudden I could not inhale without a stabbing feeling in the middle of my back. And so I was taking these shallow breaths, and the pain started to travel to my ribs, to my upper back, to my neck, to my chest. And I have later, I realized or learned through doctors telling me that I have way too high of a pain tolerance, which is sort of a blessing and a curse because I don't have a good sense of when I'm in really bad pain until it's off the charts, until it's very disabling. And then I'm like, maybe I should go get help. So long story short, I ended up going to the ER and getting hospitalized because the pain was so intense that it had impacted my heart. And so they thought that I had a cardiac event, maybe a blood clot. And so there was like, you might die. Like, we're on standby. Like there was just this crazy. And then too, there was COVID regulation. So my husband couldn't be there overnight with me. And I'm just shaking thinking, man, am I ever going to see my daughter again? Who was like 4 or 5 at the time. And it was just so sudden and so random. And so that began a journey of what I can only describe as really just an extreme time of darkness and mystery for me. I had already been in an experience of chronic pain. I got diagnosed with stage 4 endometriosis earlier in that same year.
Wow.
Excuse me, earlier in 2020, I should say, and had already had 2 surgeries up at that point. We were dealing with secondary infertility for years at that point because of the endometriosis. So I knew pain, but the back was a whole other beast. And so I ended up having just really bad chronic upper back pain, mid back pain for about 1.5 years, 2 years. And I got hospitalized multiple times through that because it kept affecting my heart. And so in that time, I had to let go of this manuscript for a time being. I had to let go of any opportunity to teach, to speak, the things that, have been, what I felt like was my calling and giftedness and everything just got stripped away. With that, financial trauma, with that, having to be carried by family and friends, not just financially, but emotionally, spiritually, and then losing friends who couldn't quite grasp the severity of the suffering and the impact it had on us and on my husband as a caretaker. And so it was just kind of like the perfect storm for a long time. And that drove me deeper into trauma therapy and understanding why the wounds of that season were so profound, besides the fact that they really were just really bad, but also that they harkened back to my past experiences, my past abuse, my past trauma, and things of that nature. So all that to say, I felt like in that time when I was not actively working on this manuscript, that I was not writing, I wasn't working on it. I also felt like the silence of God was really profound. I cannot hear you. I cannot perceive you. As Job said, is like, if you walk by, I don't perceive it. I don't know. And yet when I did finally start to come to a place of a little bit more health and functionality, and my life has never been the same. I am in some ways kind of disabled, and I'm still trying to like embrace that term. But as I did, get to find some measure of health and pick up this manuscript again, I realized that in that darkest of seasons, where I felt like God wasn't forming me, where I felt like I could not hear his voice, as I looked back at my journals in that time, there was formation happening. There were lessons that I was learning, and some of those find themselves now in the pages of my book. So, yeah.
You say at one point in your book, the silence of God is a psalm. Did I say that right? Is that what you said?
Yeah. So I kind of confess at the beginning of the book that I'm not good at this, like that. I'm unqualified yet compelled, to write about the love of God. Unqualified, or I feel the unqualifiedness because I have struggled so much with does God exist? 1, 2, if he exists, does he even like me? Not sure about that, even though I've tended to intellectualize my faith for so long. There's reasons for that, but there's, just learning all the verses, but not really experiencing it in my gut. And so I confess that. And then as I share about the 5 surgeries I had in the process of writing this book, losing 6 organs, the whole gambit, the chronic back pain, all of that. I mentioned that the silence of God had become like a psalm. And it's kind of hard to explain that, but I guess my best way I think of Shosaku Endu's book, Silence. Remember Silence? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That book ministered to me a lot during that time, where the missionary protagonist in that book is just struggling to feel like God is speaking into the insane persecution that he's seeing the Japanese go through, and then that he himself goes through later on. And so, and then at the end, there's a sort of a way that Jesus speaks to him that nobody would have expected in his betrayal, and so or perceived betrayal. And so, anyway, I felt like the silence of God is like that. Like, you don't think God is speaking, and yet He is writing this psalm in your life, through you, in you. And I think the book is really a testament, as long as it took, to write it, it's really a testament that God was writing something in me, despite the experience and the feeling of His silence.
That seems like, it seems like there's some sort of paradox in saying, I'm going to write about the silence of God. But I love that phrase that you just said, unqualified but compelled. And I hope you have more to say about that, because I would love to hear you talk about that.
Yeah, unqualified but compelled. And again, I try to get ahead of this at the beginning of the book. So I have 2 introductory chapters, which I remember my publisher was like, "Are we really doing 2 introductory chapters?" So I feel like I broke all the rules, because like all they asked for was 100 devotionals. I'm like, yes, let's give also 40 plus poems, and also I'm gonna have 2 essays at the beginning. So I try to get ahead of this in the book, and just sort of I think the title is called "But First a Confession," in which I state all the things I just mentioned, where I feel unqualified, in which I've discovered addictions in my story, myself. I've discovered deep embedded lies that I've just sort of undergirded a lot of my perception of self and God and people, my relationships. I have failed at friendships in so many ways. I've been failed. I've experienced a lot of reenacted traumas. There are ways that I reenact the shame that has been so prominent in my life. And as I mentioned before, in that maybe 1.5 or 2 years of just all things falling apart, I did really wonder, is God real? And then I verbalized that multiple times. He wants to kill me. And to even say that out loud means it had been brooding already for a while in my heart. This really a deep core belief that God is out to get me, that He's out to smite me. And that it's just, I felt like, man, well, how can I, somebody who has verbalized multiple times throughout the course of that 4 or so years of writing this book, God is, he doesn't like me. He wants to kill me. I'm a cosmic joke. I'm an embarrassment. And how could I really pen genuine words about the love of God? And there is something paradoxical about that. It is, I've laughed and I've cried as I think about how to answer that. It's like, well, I don't deserve to. I am not some sort of champion of faith, but at the same time, that is actually good news, because there is a hero in my story, and it's not me. Not to sound like cliche, but it's true. I mean, if anybody should have quit by now, if anybody should have, I've dealt with suicidal ideation. I have complex PTSD, like just the whole gambit. So if anybody has felt like not fit or not in strong in any sense, it is me. And and yet here I am, praying this morning and reading my Bible and somehow like being here, writing this book. So, I mean, yeah, unqualified, but compelled. I don't try to pretend like I am something I'm not, as much as I, maybe want to, but I don't.
Yeah. I think unqualified but compelled would be a great thing to cross stitch onto a pillow. It's a great motto. I think it's a great motto for a writer.
Yeah.
To say, because you wake up every morning and feel, I mean, quite apart from the traumas you're talking about, I think it's a very familiar feeling for a writer to start trying to put words on a page and feeling completely unqualified. Both at the level of just putting sentences together, but also having something to say. And I think it's a real act of courage to say, I'm not qualified to do this, but I'm compelled to do it. I'm going to do it. I'm not going to say no.
Yeah, 100%. I think the chorus in my life for so long was like, but I'm not an expert on anything. And so I've wrestled with God, like, God, why can't I just be normal? Like, why couldn't I have just been like a nurse or a teacher or something that's just like you get your training and then you go do the thing? Why?
And you act out of your expertise.
Yeah, and you act out of your expertise. Like, why writing when for multiple reasons, like the sort of story of me and money in my life, of financial trauma and this sort of core belief that God's not going to take care of me. And I've experienced seasons of prolonged like poverty. And so being like, really, a writer? Like we make pennies if we do, if we, for the most part, like unless you're famous or something. But and then too, the foolishness of it all, right? As a writer, as an artist in general, is like my family is, I'm Filipino, Puerto Rican, Jamaican. So I come from a family full of immigrants, and, for the most part, they're really successful, like really wealthy. They've found their careers. They've done well for themselves. And so I've felt already like an oddball in that I do take Jesus like very seriously, but also an oddball in that, and a fool. Like I felt foolish. Like, man, I write poems about sometimes just chopping garlic slow. Like, what did you do today? Like they landed some huge account. Like I wrote a poem and took it slow. So I wrestled with the foolishness of it all and the fear of the bottom falling out financially for us. And God has been ministering to those wounds through the process.
Yeah. Does you say you feel foolish for doing this kind of work when you've got these successful family members. Does your family think you're foolish for doing
so it depends probably who you ask.
That's a fair question to ask.
Yeah. No, I think my parent, I think I've internalized a lot of things as a child of immigrants. Not myself was born in the Philippines, but I was raised here. So I say I'm a child of immigrants. My dad's from Jamaica. My mom's from the Philippines. And when I think about this, and this is pretty common for children of immigrants, is like when you think about the sacrifices that they made so that I could go to a private school, so that I could have the sort of education and experiences, the extracurricular experiences I had. I feel, man, one of the big experiences of shame for me has been like, I feel like I'm an embarrassment. Like I haven't attained. I think of Jacob, actually, at the end of Genesis, when he blesses Pharaoh and Pharaoh asks how old he is. He's like, my years of sojourn have been like 153, and they haven't even attained to my ancestors. There's a sense of grief he feels there. He's like, I haven't even attained to my fathers. And that's sort of a grief.
It was Joseph who said that?
Jacob. As at the end of Genesis. And I feel that, I'm like, man, I haven't attained to their level of grind and sacrifice. And I'm 35 years old, and I'm only like in this season, like the last few months, really embracing the weirdness of following Jesus and the ways that he is more than allowed to change the script and teach me what it means to rest, teach me what it means to be beloved outside of my productivity. And it's just been such a long process. I feel like I'm a slow learner, but Jesus is just a very patient teacher. And what you said earlier, it's like he's inviting me out of so many narratives that have fueled our experiences generationally as a family. And yet he's not just calling me out of that, he's calling me into something that that maybe, we haven't experienced, that I have never experienced, namely rest, being delighted in, being the beloved. And so, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I had, I think a lot of writers, feel what you're talking about. This, what I'm doing doesn't make sense to the people who love me, and, but I've never talked to a child of immigrants about this topic. It really is an interesting dynamic.
I think there's layers to it for sure. I think just, like you said, any writer, any artist could feel the foolishness of it all.
Sure.
And yet you feel like you can't, like it won't let go of you, the need to express and to write or to do your art. And then the other layer, like I said, is just being, child of immigrants. Whether or not sometimes parents have put that explicitly on their children of, we came to this country, you need to make it, you need to be a doctor, you need to be a lawyer. Although I didn't have that maybe explicitly, there were things that implicitly I began to believe, and I don't even think I realized how much I believed that until I got older. I'm like, well, this was cute in my 20s, but now I'm in my 30s, and you got to pay for eggs, and doing poetry doesn't necessarily pay for eggs, and so And
so you said it's something that won't let go of you, but of course, a lot of people do let go.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, and I'm always interested in knowing why people don't just quit. Like, I happen to, I'm blessed to live in a place, like I'm around people who do creative work, and it doesn't seem quite so insane, except they're just kind of insane. And, and maybe you are surrounded by people who do creative work. Are you?
I have been. I was in Tampa for 15 years, so I was around a good amount of creative, peers. And then I moved
really
to
not
Orlando.
Far from the Wiki Watching Mermaid show. So there are people who
there you go
performers around.
Yes. Then I when I moved to Orlando, we were still in that season of just needing to survive. I still had a total hysterectomy that I was, not looking forward to, but had to look forward to. And so there was just like a lot of, my focus just wasn't that. And it's so interesting because like so many times I have actively tried to quit with regard to writing. I'm not going to journal, so there's big gaps in my journals, and there's big gaps of time where I haven't actively written. But I will say, as a follower of Jesus, I have felt like a very big paradigm shift when I started to see the commands of Jesus as invitations, not to minimize, the holiness of God or anything, like the importance of obedience or anything like that. But when he tells the leper, be clean, I don't think he means like, go clean yourself. I mean, I think he's giving a blessing and an invitation into blessing. And so including when he says, be holy. And so all that to say, if Jesus and God throughout like the whole scriptures are saying, come, there's always this invitation, come, the book of Isaiah, come, Jesus in Matthew 11, come, Revelation, the church and the bride say, come, there's always this invitation to come. That's at least at minimum what I know. Okay, so my life is falling apart. Everything's tearing at the seams. I don't know if I'm really even a writer. I'm not an expert. All these things that swirl around in our minds. But I do know one thing, and that is to come. And so in just whatever state I'm in that day, if I just come, who knows what will happen there. But I do know God, he rewards those who diligently seek him, and he just invites us to come. Yeah. So I've just tried to make a habit of, 19 years of stumbling after Jesus, of just keep coming back. I just keep coming back. And in doing so, have felt a renewed invitation, even more recently, where I felt like the Spirit just said, do not neglect the pen. And that did not give me a promise that I'll be published again. It did not give me a promise about selling any number of books. It was simply, this is what I'm inviting you into. Do not neglect the pen. And so as I take Jesus up on that and go, okay, I'll go read my Bible as I usually do, but I'll bring my pen with me and a journal. Yeah. And out has just come just boom, 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 explosions of creativity. And maybe not all of them will find their way out into the public, but some will probably. And I know that I'm more whole as I've leaned into that invitation.
Yeah. Wow. We haven't talked about one facet of what you do, and that's spoken word.
Yeah. Yeah.
How do you get in the spoken word business?
Well, yeah, business.
What's the career path for that?
There is none. Like, I don't know that there is one. Again, the foolishness, right? So, no, I came to know the Lord at 16. I was an athlete. That was kind of like part of what defined my life, along with academics. And so a friend on my volleyball team shared the gospel with me on the way to a volleyball game on a bus ride. And so that was my introduction, if you will, to the faith. And so as I began to walk with Jesus, as I began to read my Bible for the first time genuinely, and I kind of came from a sort of Catholic background. So I had memorized prayers, and I did not know like this concept of praying from the heart out loud. That's like weird, like what do I do about that? So I felt safer just to write. I also, hadn't really learned the language of the fact that I have this invitation to feel, like have emotions and to express them. And so the journal was a much safer place for me to sort of process what I was learning and going through. And out would come poetry, which is so crazy because my friend who shared the gospel with me reminded me a couple years later, like, you were terrible at this when we did the poetry segment in 10th grade. You were actually so bad. And I was like, I know I was. So it that was one of the surprises along the way of, wow, I don't know why this is coming out as poetry. I'm not saying it's good. It's just coming out that way. Yeah. And an English teacher in high school caught wind of that and was like, she wanted to put together this poetry slam. I went to a really big, diverse high school in Orlando. It was called University High School. And she wanted me to memorize and perform my poem. And she sort of like said I was going to do it instead of asking. And so I was like, okay, yes, ma'am. And I just saw it as an opportunity to creatively share my faith experience. And so when I did that, it was like groups of 300 students. That was sort of my introduction to what it looks like to not just write poetry, but memorize, embody, perform in a somewhat of a form of theater. And when I saw the faces of my peers, the friends that would come, friends and people that I didn't really know well, would come after the show up to me, and with tears in their eyes would express how this line hit them or that aspect made them think differently. And I think that was when I first began to see, well, there might be something here. And thank God that along the way, there have been people within the body of Christ that have encouraged that gift. As much as I've struggled with it, because it is I'm not naturally somebody who like needs to have the mic and needs to be at the front of the stage. So, yeah.
How has that orality, or that the act of memorizing and performing your poetry, how has that shaped the way you write, or I guess I should say, has it shaped the way you write?
Oh yeah, definitely has. One, just the discipline of writing poetry, and that it slows you down as you're writing. So there's a sort of meditation that is happening where you're mulling over each line and each word and the weight of it and the way that it could be a part of a rhyme scheme, the way that it, how it can land at what if I change it to this. So there's a very meticulous care. I think of kintsugi art, like that art form where the kintsugi masters like takes this meticulous care of bringing the broken pieces of a tea set together. And so I think poetry is somewhat similar in the fact that you're taking this labor of love that's very meticulous, and it's slowing you down, slowing your body and your brain down. Just as when you read poetry, it slows you down. It's meant to be read slowly. Yeah. And so there's that. And then two, in the performance side of it is the embodiment of the text. So I remember my favorite class in college was, I got to take this performance communication class, and we talked a lot about that, and we got to experience that. And it helped me to really connect that to what, my gift and even ministry, which is that when you're performing, you're actually embodying, just as an actor does, somebody else's story, or maybe even your own story. You're entering into through empathy their story. And so most of my writing has been at some form of storytelling, one way or another, whether I'm talking about myself or characters in the Bible or whatever. It has in the repetition of practicing your performance, because you need to memorize it. And I need to know, when I say this line, my hands are going to do this. When I say that line, my body is going to hunch over and do that. And so just in inviting your body into the text and into the experience, there's an embodiment of what you're teaching. You're not just proclaiming with your mouth, you're also living it out through your body. I think of actually even the Old Testament prophets where there's some level of theater there, and not necessarily to like entertain, but where they are embodying something, some sort of message that Yahweh had for the children of Israel. And so, I think that's part of, what that experience has been for me.
Yeah. I'd never made the connection between prophecy and spoken word or performance. I guess I thought it was performance art. I mean, lying down in a cistern for 40 days or whatever it was. That's you should try that. Have you thought about lying down in a cistern for?
I felt like I have, but
yeah, right. Okay, last question. Quina, who are the writers who make you want to write?
I was just on Substack this morning, so the one that's fresh on my mind is Kat Armas. She, I believe, don't quote me here, I believe she's Cuban American.
Okay.
And you can find her on Substack.
Could you spell that last name?
Armas is Armas. Yeah.
Okay.
Her writing is just very poetic, beautiful. And I just like the way she thinks, the way she's willing to be very curious about passages that we've maybe had an understanding of what if it could be here, and without trying to stray into some crazy land or anything like that. Yeah. So I appreciate her thinking and her writing style. Yaa Gyasi, the Ghanaian American author of Homegoing, and what's the other one? Transcendent Kingdom. I don't know if she's written other books, but those two impacted me a ton. Okay. I appreciate her willingness in her writing to engage our humanity, particularly in Transcendent Kingdom, as the protagonist is sort of, I think, agnostic maybe, and she sort of lands in a sort of different place near the end of the book. But in her struggle with in that book, the protagonist struggle with understanding her brother's addiction and her father's abandonment. For me, there was such an invitation in some of my darkest moments to see what it looks like to actually put words to my wrestling with God and engaging my humanity in a fresh way. So I love her writing. Her first name.
Tell me again her name. You're about
it's Yaa is the first name, and then Gyasi, I think, is spelled Gyasi. I quote her in my book, so that's why I think I might remember it. But yes, those two for sure.
Great. Well, thanks. I don't know either of those writers, so thank you for introducing me.
So good.
Great. All right, Quina Aragon, so glad to have you here. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much.
The Habit Podcast is brought to you by The Rabbit Room, where art nourishes community and community nourishes art. You can support their work, including this podcast, by becoming a member. Visit rabbitroom.com/membership. Special thanks as well to Taylor Leonard for letting us use her song Diamonds as the theme music for the Habit Podcast. You can learn more about Taylor and follow her work at taylorleonard.com. The Habit membership is a library of resources for writers by me, Jonathan Rogers. More importantly, The Habit is a hub of community where like-minded writers gather to discuss their work and give each other a little more courage. Find out more at thehabit.co.
If you've enjoyed this podcast episode, consider joining the Rabbit Room membership. Your membership helps sustain this community, funding everything from publishing and podcasts and theater productions to events and programs that support artists who create with a Christ-centered vision. We'd love to have you on board. Learn more at rabbitroom.com/member.